Welcome to this video lecture as part of the course Qualitative Methods for Business and Management. This video lecture is part of a three-part series of lectures on the history and philosophy of qualitative research. In this particular lecture, we will talk about the rise of new philosophical assumptions in the beginning of qualitative research. It follows the earlier lecture on the brief introduction to the philosophy of science. Now, we ended the last lecture by looking at the main principles of the scientific method and then stopping with the example of Jane Goodall and her work as an anthropologist with primate apes, chimpanzees, that violated a lot of the principles we set out to be hallmarks of good science, such as independence, precision, and so forth. So this was meant as an example, of course, a contrastful example of a broader development that occurred in the philosophy and the sciences roughly over pretty much exactly the last 100 years, so from around the 1920s onwards. Now, remember, 1920s was about the time we had Einstein versus Freud, we had Popper distilling the principles or the logic of scientific discovery, also the ideas of the scientific methods about experimentation, falsification of theories, precision, independence, replicability, and so forth. Now, put in a larger context, science, when we talk about that, a lot of that science was really only about natural science, the study of naturally occurring objects and events, things we can see, touch, measure. Right? So like the planets, the stars, physics, chemistry, biology, and so forth. So much of when we talked about science was really about these types of sciences, right? Naturally occurring objects. We started realizing, though, in the late 1900s, so, 1880, 1890, and so forth, we started seeing that scientists also began studying other things that were not naturally occurring, but socially occurring. So we call them now the social sciences. So the study of socially constructed objects and events, society, a family, friendship, relationships, countries even, right? So these are not naturally occurring things. There is no such a thing such as Germany. Germany is a social construct, right? It's a nation that we declare as a nation, and we're all Germans, and we have borders that don't exist, right? They only exist on a map that we drew ourselves. So these are socially occurring or socially constructed objects that don't naturally occur, like a stone wood or a tree, or the planets and the stars and so forth of the universe. So this was a new type of science, a science not of naturally occurring things where we could find out natural laws and, begin to use our, scientific methods in our experiments to figure out how exactly this rock would behave. Yeah. So instead, we would have a social science that would look at how socially occurring things that were important to our lives, our families, our firms, our society, law, our countries and, the continent and what it means to be European and so forth. How these things, how could we study them? Now, naturally, what people started doing first is they started what we would now call the social science, a positivist social science. Basically, the idea is, well, if we have a science of new things, a science of social things, not natural things, well, it's still a science, isn't it? It should be exactly like we do science on naturally occurring things, where we have a couple of 100 years of, evolution behind us. And now, thanks to Popper, thanks to other people, we have these principles of how to do that well. Right? So let's do social science in the same way we do natural science, meaning as a positivist science where we have a specific object of study, not naturally occurring things, but social facts, right? So ways of acting throughout a given society that exists, sort of, right? There is this thing called the family. It's not a naturally occurring thing, but it's still a thing. It's still a fact. It's a social fact, right? But it's there and we can measure it and, we can create knowledge about it. Right? And of course, at the same time, while we do have a different object of study, it's kind of the same thing. That means we need to have a respectable and accepted scientific method, right? As close as possible to the exact sciences, the natural science, where we've used these for a couple hundred years, right? So again, independence, objectivity, precision, experimentation, falsification. If we want to do social science, um, and be real scientists like the natural science, like the physicists and chemists and so forth, then we must do it the same way, right? So this was the birth of social science as a field of study. And you can see here a text from 1990 by a philosopher, so to speak, a scientist called Emil Durkheim. He kind of proposed this, right? So method, sociology, right? The social science, sociology, everything about socially occurring facts and events and constructs and things was born, right? Um, so this distinction goes on to this day, right? So if you go and talk to the physicists, they, look down, so to speak, on the social scientists. Oh, you're not a real scientist because, we discover the laws of the universe and you talk about how people feel, right? So this is one of these classical prejudices, and it stems back to this distinction, to this point where people started realizing we need a science of the social things in our world, in our reality, because they matter to us, you know? Again, 1920, after the First War, the question of, you know, which nationality are you? Are you a right wing or left wing? Are you a nationalist? Are you, whatever? Are you a communist? These sorts of things became very, very important in people's lives. And of course, families have always been, or have for a long time been important. And, things like what is the firm that you're working on? All these things, all these social constructions that we say, this is my family, you're not part of the family, you're German, you're not German, you're a communist, no, you're a nationalist, whatever, you're capitalist, all these things, all these distinctions that you can't really touch and feel, but that are still there and they're still very important to how life progress, right? Politically speaking, there was a big fight between capitalism and communism going on. We had, after the First World War, we had nationalist movements versus libertarian movement. We had the abandonment of kingdoms and empires and the rise of republics and sort of, nationalist, democratic sort of political regimes. So all these things were not touchy-feely, right? So they're not things in the natural sense. They're not objects, right? They're social constructions, but they were very, very important to what happened to peoples and how their lives progressed. And of course, then with the overall blossoming of science as a way of creating knowledge and, and bettering the human condition, right? Like creating things that make, everything better in a way, more effective, more productive, God knows, cheaper, better, more convenient. We needed a science of the social things. Yeah. So remember, I mentioned this in the very first lecture. One of the first, what people started doing is they started with this rise of the social science, came also rise of, qualitative methods such as AK study, the study of AKs. Yeah, NRO, Bertha Pappenheim, was a very interesting first case of someone that was not physically ill, but mentally. He was psychologically ill. She was sick without being physically sick, right? And this was an interesting case that you couldn't really experiment. You didn't have a lot of statistics. It wasn't generalizable, but it was still interesting enough to look at, right? So even though it's not necessarily the same thing, with the rise of the social science came also the start of people doing what we would now call qualitative research, like looking, observing certain interesting cases in depth, not in breadth, maybe talking to people, and not just, building numbers and playing around with statistics. So what happened then, this took a while, right? So this took 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Didn't happen that there was another world war in between, right? So from the 1920s, World War, after the World War, we then had especially in business management, a rise of the quantitative science. We had the birth of economics, right? Statistical, mathematical, precise data on what businesses do, how they should be operating, and so forth. But we also had more development in the social sciences, especially by a guy who's now called well, it's not called, a guy called Anthony Giddens, who actually went back to these ideas of the social science in Durkheim And he said, well, we shouldn't have the social science just like the natural science, same procedure with a different study object, social facts, not naturally occurring facts, because social facts, the social objects that we're interested in, they're not just, objects that are naturally occurring, right? In that social aspect, like society, only has a form and has a meaning in what people do. Yeah. So the idea of a family is irrelevant unless it has an influence on what you actually do day in and day out. Whether or not hail communism or capitalism, or whether you like democracy or not, or whether you're a right wing or left wing, doesn't matter unless it makes you do certain things. Yeah. So social facts did not exist in their own right and were not worthy of studying in their own right as objects that are independent from what people do, like a rock would be that exists, or a planet that would just exist and be there. Social facts, institutions, law, power, families, organizations, they only have meaning in what people do when they exercise these social facts, depending on whatever they want to do, right? If we don't do anything, if I don't do anything based on my communist beliefs, who cares? If I'm an extremist right-wing nationalist, it doesn't matter unless I do stuff, okay? So social facts attain meaning in what people do based on their motives, not as objects in their own right. And that is a key distinction, right? In that means, or that meant that if you wanted to understand more about these social facts, these social things like our organizations, our families, our relationships, our forms of arrangements like marriages, things like law, power. A law only matters if it's exercised. If it's not exercised, who cares about the law? Right? We need to study, we need to interpret what people do and what their motives are. Yeah, so we need to interpret people's behavior to understand how socially constructed things influence them. We can't study them separate from the people that exercise them. Yeah, so this was a key point, right? So unlike the natural science, in the social science, we do not stand in the subject-object relationship where I am studying an object. The researcher as a person, study an object that exists and I'm measuring and observing it. No, I am studying other subjects. I, as a person, study other persons and what they do. So what I do is I study, and what you do is you behave in your family and you do certain things. So we stand in a subject-subject relationship. So my job as a researcher is all of a sudden interpreting what you do. And of course, when you do things that you do, has an influence of what I do as well, right? And this is what is now called the so-called double hermeneutic. What does that mean? It means that typically in research, we have a one-way understanding. We want to understand the actions and behaviors of minerals, of chemicals, of objects, of planets, of trees, of rocks, and whatever else. But they don't try to understand us. Yeah. So this is a single hermeneutic, right? If I'm studying the structure of a protein, if I'm just studying the structure of the human DNA, if I'm studying the planetary movements in a different faraway galaxy, that galaxy is not at the same time trying to understand me. This is classic in a subject-object relationship, but it's not the same in the social science. Because I am studying other people, I as a subject have a subject-subject relationship. I cannot help but avoid that while I am studying and observing what people do, they're also observing and trying to understand me, right? They can think, they can make choice, they can obtain new information and use that information to revise their understanding or their beliefs and change their action in response. Right? When I'm studying the rock's not doing anything. While I'm studying you, and you know that I'm studying you, you will alter your behavior in response. That is a double hermeneutic, right? So I'm studying you while you're studying me, basically, right? So whatever I study in my social science enters into the very things that I'm studying. I'm changing it as I'm going along, okay? So this is getting very philosophical, but these were two key departures, right? So the first departure is let's build a social science, a science of social things, and let's do it like the natural science. And then comes Giddens 50 years later, and now we're already in the 70s and saying, hang on, we can't do it quite the same way because we're not studying the same things, and because we're not studying objects but other subjects, because I can't study social constructions without the people that exercise and live and behave because of these social structures. I can only study people. Right? I can't study a firm. I can't study the law. I can study lawyers. I can study police officers. I can study courtrooms, but I can't study the law because the law doesn't exist unless it's exercised by people, right? So it's not the same as a natural science just of social objects. It's its own thing, okay? And this became then a so-called not a positivist relationship science like the natural science, where we try to positively confirm or disconfirm particular properties of an object, but instead we are tasked with interpreting what other people do to try to derive conclusions about socially constructed things. Now we saw, again, 50s, 60s, 70s now, not too far, too long ago, that we had new methods that were based on this philosophy, right? Phenomenology, ethnography, grounded theories were all new methods that apply more to this interpretive philosophy, not to a classical positivist scientific method philosophy. And here is exactly how someone like Jane Goodall fits in, right? She would do something that we now call an ethnography, right? The practical, common, everyday life of, in her case, private apes by being one of them, by being part of them, by behaving and seeing what they are so you can understand in more depth how they exercise social construction. What does family mean to an ape? I can only study that by seeing what they do. And I can't ask them about it. I can't experiment on them. I can't give them a survey to fill out. I can't even interview them. The only thing I can do is be with them and observing while they're doing the things that they do to try to understand and interpret what it is that they're doing. So an interpretive way of doing science, right? Another thing that then in this 60s and 70s, with this rise of this interpretive philosophy and this rise of the new social science, were also new methods such as the grounded theory, which I explained to you before, right? This way of, can we come up with new theories based on inductively looking at new data? Because the classical research method didn't work here, right? Remember, I mentioned this in the first case. Andrew Strauss in 1961 or two, I can't remember, he went to visit Barney Gleiser in University of California. They went to the medical school and saw people dying everywhere, of course, right? In a hospital, people die, but they die differently, right? In the oncology department, in the oncology ward, you had people that knew they were dying, and it could take forever. It could take a long, long time, right? Could take months, could take years until until someone that knows he has cancers and he's being treated for cancer and he knows he's untreatable, he knows they will pass away. That process of dying is very, very different from, let's say, the process of dying that you would see in an infant clinic, right? Childbirth, where also people die, unfortunately, mothers die, babies die, but it's not the same process. They don't know that they're dying. It's a horrible event. Everything goes wrong, but still death occurs. But it's not the same process of dying. And you couldn't do. And Andrew Strauss and Barney Glaser, they realized that they couldn't do scientific method on this. For you can't experiment without a hypothesis. There was no theory of dying available that they could test against the data they could observe. So in fact, they had to create their own theory on this, right? And of course, you can't do a lot of experimentation either. You can't experiment with people dying, right? For obvious ethical reasons, right? You can't have a bunch of people die and the other people not die, right? And also you can't ask people that had just died how that dying process was, right? So a lot of the typical scientific methods weren't available. They couldn't study what they wanted to study, so they came up with a new method that was qualitative, inductive, interpretive, and came up with a social theory of how dying in hospital unfolds, depending on, of course, the condition and your history and everything around, like a social theory of all the things that matter to the dying process, as a qualitative, interpretive social science methodology. And this has become very famous, of course, this idea of grounded theory, not just for dying theories, of course, but as a way of doing research in a way that is interpretive, qualitative, inductive, and social. Okay? So this is a good example, and it's not long ago, it's 50 years old, where we have now a new way of doing science, new assumptions coming up that social science is different, the objects are different, and we need different methods to get at them because, very importantly, the classical standard scientific methods we have available, such as experimentation, cannot be used to answer questions. So there are things in the world where we want to construct knowledge about where the scientific method is insufficient, right? So qualitative research, especially since the 60s and 70s, came up as a way of overcoming limitations and weaknesses of traditional scientific methods. That's very important, right? Because you had qualitative methods that were designed to be good at things that classical scientific methods such as surveys, such as experiments in the social sciences that we've used for about 50 years that we know they weren't good at, right? So they were born as a counterproposal to be good at things that the other ones were not, while being bad at the things that we already had good methods for. Yeah. So what's the point of all of that? Why am I explaining this to you? Well, because we realize that now we realize what is now called a pluralistic view of science, saying that we understand that there's more than one way of doing science. This is quite different from what Popper, talked about when he looked at Einstein and Freud and tried to determine who's the better scientist. Well, we're like this one is doing science correctly, the other one's a charlatan, right? Like this one's good, the other one's bad. No, now I realize there's multiple ways of doing science, and they all have certain strengths and they all have certain weaknesses. And without going too deep here, we can very, very, very broadly distinguish two main philosophies, two main paradigms or sets of philosophical assumptions. And I mentioned their names already. One of this is this view that is called positivism, a positivist view of the world, a worldview where researchers assume that there is a reality that is objectively out there, and our job as researchers is to discover it and describe it by measured properties that exist independent of the observer. There are planets, they have mass, location, velocity, density, all these sorts of things. And if I have really good instruments, I can get to something that is very, very close to the true state of this artifact. So they have objective properties that are not dependent on who I am, what I think, what I do, and so forth, right? So a positivist worldview is coined by a realist and objectivist ontology. So the idea that there are objectively existing things in reality combined with an empiricist epistemology. So the idea that we can construct knowledge about these objects by measuring really, really carefully and precisely, right? So this way I can say there are roads, I can measure the lengths, I can measure density, I can measure traffic, etc., and I can reason about them, right? So in this particular worldview, science is then all about unearthing truth, getting as close as possible to the true state of whatever object I'm interested in. Now, this object can be naturally occurring there. This is where it's coming from. We have there are atoms, we can measure their structure and their properties, etc. But you can apply the same things to social science, right? There are families, right? We can describe, we can say there is a family, of people that share my blood or whatever. My kids objectively have some of my DNA in them, right? So you can say, look, there are positivist things I can say about my family through my blood ties and so forth and so forth. And I can reason about them, and I can find out things about them by using empirical observations, right? So in this particular worldview about science, it's about unearthing truth. And what we try to do here is we try to build theories about these occurring objects, social or natural, creating very good measurements, very precise measurements, very independent measurements, objective measurements, and try to falsify or not these theories to distinguish truth from myth. Okay? So in the way that we say, like, look, we have these, this is my family. This is really objectively existing. If your theory says I have 7 kids, but I can prove through DNA tests or whatever that I only have 3, then your theory is wrong. Not my kids are wrong, right? Your theory must be wrong because I can prove that I have only, 3 kids, not 7, as far as I know. So this is positivism. The other worldview is this alternative philosophy that's now called interpretive philosophy or interpretive science, right? That says, like, look, there are parts to this world that are not objectively occurring, but they're socially constructed. You see Berger and Luckmann's very famous book here, Social Construction of Reality, right? That there are aspects to our reality, the reality in which we all act, that only exist in our language, in our consciousness, and in shared meanings we give things. Meaning that my idea of what my family is different from yours. Yeah, so for example, I don't know whether your second grade grand cousin, is that your family or is that not? Right? Like, so is that like, would you invite them to your wedding or not? Right? So this is your have a particular view of family and who you should invite to your wedding, and it probably isn't the same as mine, and so forth. Right? So there's also an aspect to this idea of a family that only exists in whatever I call it, whether I call it family or not, what I understand or how I interpret the meaning of the word family, and of course, then importantly, what I do with this meaning, right? So when I and my wife sit down and decide, these people should come to my wedding or not, I invite, go to their birthplace or I don't, right? So there's several of these examples. There are also aspects that are socially constructed. Money, currency is one of these examples, right? Currency basically only exists because we have agreed in most of our societies on these planets, in most, not in all, that it has importance and value, and we use it as a way of determining the worth of certain things, processes, events, experience, of whatever, objects, and being able to trade it this way. Yeah, because it's an easier way, a more rational, kind of more objective way, if you want, than debating all the time whether 2 cows are the same as 5 goats, and whether your marriage partner is worth 3 camels, or whatever else, right? So currency is such an idea. That's a socially constructed aspect of our reality, but you probably help, like, it's an important one. Yeah, that's a very simple example, but you can find very modern example as well. So for example, the idea of who am I? Yeah, what is my self-identity, and what does it have to do with sex and gender, and whether sex and gender are even the same thing, etc. This is a debate that's raging, yeah, with very entrenched polar viewpoints at times, where people have particular views on whether or not sex and gender are objectively given, whether they're socially constructed, and how they all phone together your identity. Yeah, this is a very modern, and you see this in things like gender pronouns, of course, in the distinction between sex and gender, which frankly speaking, 20 years ago, no one talked about. These were not two different things, right? And now it's 3 things: identity, sex, and gender, and it's then even a self and a external and so on. So it gets very, very complicated. But clearly, and thankfully, we all agree by now, there are these socially constructed aspects of reality, and they are important too, right? So to understand, to get at these things that don't really exist, that only exist in our social construction, in meaning we assign to people, that we have in our head, that we communicate through language, and of course that manifest in the actions we do, we need to be not discover of truth, because the only thing is we can try to interpret. We need to try to understand phenomena through the meanings that people assign to them, and in the actions what they do. If you do something, what does that mean? Right? Why are you doing this? Is this because you have a particular view of family, sex, gender, currency, political orientation, whatever? Um, how does that manifest? And how can I interpret what you do based on some of these beliefs that are sort of, that don't objectively exist, and I can't really objectively and independently measure, because they only manifest in what you do and how I interpret what you do. That is an interpretive perspective of the world, and therefore an interpretive science. Yeah. So you can try to put both of these different viewpoints side by side, right? In positivism, we say there's an objective aspect to the human experience. It's testable. It's independent of explanations, independent of the research or other subjects. A rock is a rock is a rock, right? In interpretive, data and facts are constructed in light of interpretation. I can't detach these things. I can interpret your behavior, but it's my interpretation of your behavior. You might see it differently. Other people might see it differently, right? So same with theories are mimetic reconstructions. I am giving you an interpretation of what you just did. I'm trying to understand it, not necessarily explain it. I'm giving you I'm interpreting what you've done in a different way, from a different perspective. I'm reconstructing facts, like your behaviors or what you said and so forth. In the positive worldview, theories are artificial models. They're mental models that give us logic that we see manifest in objective things. Yeah. So meaning our constitutes that meanings are separate. So hopefully you'll see now that we have these distinctions and how they apply to different research, depending on how you see the world and what you think is more, important to the particular study of a particular object. So this brings us why this is important for qualitative research. Because, very importantly, qualitative research is often, but not necessarily, interpretive research. We can do qualitative research in a very classic positivist scientific method kind of way. Yeah. But we can also do it in the interpretive tradition. Unlike quantitative research, which is by and large the classical positivist, hypothetical, deductive model of science, the classical scientific methods, qualitative research, because it is so flexible, can be used in both positivist and interpretive traditions. I can choose. This is huge. Yeah? This is a huge distinction. If I do an experiment, I do an experiment. But if I do a case study, I must ask, well, what kind of case study are you doing? What assumptions are governing your reading? Are you doing an interpretive case study or a positive case study? Are you trying to unearth truth? Or are you trying to, generate or reconstruct an interpretation of what happened? Hugely different things, because I need to do different things, and I need to apply different evaluation criteria to understand which of them has been done good. Yeah. So the different traditions come with very different principles for how we should be doing this research. And we have different quality criteria, principle for evaluating what is good research. Yeah. So, for example, if you're in a positive worldview and you're saying, look, there's objects have a true state. My job is to discover the truth. I need to get as close as possible to the true state of an object. There we have traditional quality criteria that are called, for example, reliability and validity. And you can think of them as shooting a bow at a target, right? And you're trying to hit bullseye in the middle. If you do, that's the true state of the object, bullseye, and you're trying to get as close as possible, and you're trying to do this reliably, consistently, right? So if you hit always the same spot, but it's never bullseye, that's a reliable but not valid measurement. If you hit bullseye once, but 20 other times you don't, then it's valid but not reliable. What you get at is on the bottom right is you want to have consistent and precise measurement of the true state. Classical example for this is if I asked you how much I weigh. If I ask 100 students in the classroom, I get close to 50 different answers. Usually when I do this, I get some people saying from 70 kilos to 120 kilos. That's not very reliable, right? So, it varies quite a lot. Some students may actually approximate the actual state of my weight, right? Like what I really weigh. So it could be reliable, but not valid, right? A much better way of measuring this, because my weight is an objective attribute, property of myself, right? I can step on a weighing scale, which is a reliable and valid way of stepping on, right? So if I step on it 20 times, I should get the same result all the time, right? And we will talk about some of these different aspects of validity and reliability in a later part when we talk about how do we evaluate good qualitative research. But let me just say that it's important to understand the distinction between positivism and interpretivism, because depending on where you sit there, this idea of validity, of getting close to the true score of an object, isn't even possible in interpretive traditions. Like there is no true objective property or value of a particular property of an object. Yeah, so we can't test for validity. What we can test for is credibility, right? So credibility of my finding is not the same as validity of finding. So that this is true knowledge, but it's credible. It's a credible finding. I can believe that finding. It's a finding, gives me sufficient substantiated evidence for the interpretation in my research, even though I can't say that this is necessarily and unequivocally true, right? Same with reliability. Reliability would mean that if I measure the same things over and over again, I get the consistent results. But of course, I can't really do this in interpretations, can I, right? As I'm interpreting, the people that I'm interpreting interpret me, right? The double hermeneutic. And of course, as I'm interpreting something, I'm getting new information. The information challenges my own assumptions. So, I'm not in the same state anymore. As I'm studying people, these people are impacted of me studying them. And of course, I'm impacted and updating all my assumptions and my knowledge as I'm studying them. So by nature, that's not reliable at all, but it can be dependable, right? Dependable would mean that I offer an interpretation that other researchers could agree on, that they would reach similar sort of conclusions. So it's an interpretation that is not entirely subjective, but it's dependable in the same that other people could reach similar conclusions, similar interpretations, right? Imagine 5 people watching someone, doing crazy stuff at yeah, I don't know, at a demonstration, and we all would reach the interpretation that this is a very extremist, fascist, right-wing, whatever person, right? So that would be a more dependable interpretation than, it's just one person saying the same thing, right? So the point here is you don't need to know too much about these now. We will go through them in more detail throughout the course. The key point is that we have different quality criteria, and they mean very different things in a positivist tradition of doing qualitative research or any other research, and in an interpretive tradition. And so we have different quality criteria. And of course, we have different tactics, different ways of making sure that we, meet these quality criteria, right? So here we have replication logic. On the other hand, we have formal abstraction, we have databases corroboration, we have transparency versus pattern matching. So you see, we have different things we can do in our qualitative research process to meet or to show that we meet the quality criteria, that we pass the test, so to speak, in the different traditions. And here, what I'm doing here is I'm giving different examples, and I'm skipping them here because we will go back to them in a later stage of the course. I do want to highlight this one slide here because it's based on the reading that I gave you, Qualitative Research in the AMJ, right? So this looks at exactly the type of distinction I've tried to explain to you, positivism versus interpretive tradition, and the assumptions that we have, the goals that we follow, what we need to do, the tasks that we have to do, and sort of like some of the focus that comes with these different research traditions. The one thing I want to highlight here is that I said earlier, it's this dichotomy, positivism, interpretive, is a very simplified verse because there's also even other traditions, right? So one of them, for example, that these people here mention is critical postmodernism as yet another research tradition that comes with a different set of assumptions. There's also another one that's called critical realism. So you can have a whole bunch of different research traditions. So you can make it even more complicated than what I've already done. So don't worry, in this course, we're not going to go into critical postmodernism or critical realism for that matter either. We leave it with positivism and interpretivism as 2 main research traditions. I just wanted to point out that, it gets even more complicated, that people really take this notion of a pluralistic view of science, a recognition of many, many different assumptions and ways of about doing science and evaluating science, more than just 1 or 2. Okay. Now let me close by explaining to you why all of this matters. Yeah. I mentioned that qualitative research is very flexible in that you can use it in different configurations, either to fit a positivist tradition or a interpretive division, or by the way, a postmodern or critical realist tradition as well, right? So this is why these assumptions matter, because they determine at least 4 elements in the design of a qualitative study: the conception and use of data, the role of theory, your analysis strategy, and the nature of claims you can draw from the findings of a qualitative study. And I'm just going to show you them really quickly. This is reading is in your tasks as well. One way in which these different philosophical traditions manifest is in your conception of what data is in your study. Is it facts, or is it data as subjective understanding, right? So data as facts would be a positive way of looking at data. I can generate facts about the true state of certain things, about this firm, about its performance, about the team, about leadership, about whatever else. It could also be socially constructed reality. So a reality, data about a reality that a particular group of people, say a team working with a supervisor, yeah, or a classroom full of students and a teacher, how they construct their own reality that becomes their classroom. Or data as subjective understanding is what I think about what you think, yeah? So the subjective understanding of a person, and I'm trying to generate data about your understanding of the world so I can interpret your understanding of the world. Very different conceptions and therefore use of data in a qualitative study. Similarly, the role of theory will change depending on your philosophical position, right? In a classical positivist, hypothetically deductive, theory usually comes in to give you a falsifiable proposition hypothesis that you can test. Yeah, if this and this happens, then this and this should occur. If the team works well with a supervisor, the performance of the firm should go up. If a firm has inimitable and scalable resources, they should grow faster than others. These are all falsifiable, hypothetical, deductive, classical positivist views of theory, offering us predictions that we can test against observations, right? Can test the resources, can test the growth of the firm, can test the performance of the team, right? In an interpretive way, very often a theory serves as a conceptual mental scheme, a lens, a looking glass through which I look at the data and construct my interpretation, but it tells me sort of like which dimension should I look at. But it doesn't give me predictions that I can, test or falsify. It just tells me how I can look at the world to see many different things. Yeah. So that's a very different way of thinking about the role of theory in an interpretive way. So for example, there are theories that says, look, if you study organizations, you should look at technology, organization, and environment. Right? You should look at the environment of the firm, you should look at the technologies the firms are using, and you should look at the organization of the firm, like how is it set up, what are hierarchies and whatever else. It doesn't offer a prediction. It doesn't say this and this theory with this and this environment is better. It just says, look at these different elements. And so when you study a firm, you should look through the looking glass and always look at the environment, look at the technology and the organization, right? So it serves as a scaffolding, as a lens or a mental scheme to remind us about things we should look at, okay? Very different purpose. And again, when we generate data in whatever conception we have, using a theory in whatever conception we use it for, then the question is, how do we analyze our data? And again, we have very different strategies depending on the tradition that we're in, right? If we are in a positive ways, very often we follow a deductive analysis strategy where we take observations and measurements to deduce whether or not a theoretical prediction holds true or not. In a grounded theory way, we would inductively analyze data. We'll talk about that in more detail, but the idea would be that we look at the data and abstract from the empirical reality to theoretical concepts. In a polyphonic presentation, what we would do with data is we would try to describe the same reality through as many voices and viewpoints, polyphonic, as possible, right? To create a very rich and viewpoint about the reality, not necessarily to test some theory or to inductively create a concept from it. And of course, the nature of the claims from any one study from the findings depends on these traditions. What have you been doing? Have you been searching for truth? Have you been trying to develop a plausible understanding, not a valid one, but maybe a dependable, plausible, credible one? Or have you been developing new theories? Have you generated new concepts? Have you abstracted from reality into a generalizable set of prediction? Maybe you've done that. Or maybe you've constructed an evocative experiential text. Maybe you wanted to stir up the debate. Yeah. Maybe you wanted to even be normative, influence the views of a specific audience. You're trying to carry a particular message, maybe a political one, right? So whatever your research was about can have different nature of claims, from I discover truth to here's a way of looking at the world, here's a way of thinking about what might happen in other cases, to here's how I want you to change your own beliefs. So this has been a long part. I wanted to explain to you the rise of different philosophical assumptions with the rise of social science and the rise of interpretive philosophy, and thereby the beginnings of what we now call qualitative research. In the next video lecture, we'll talk about different genres of qualitative research and the research questions that can be answered through them. Thank you for watching, and thank you for listening.